everyone's face after we took about a 2-month break. Things seem to be going up, and we're just excited to continue looking at different moments in Jewish history. I just wanted to welcome everybody. In case you don't know, I'm Aaron Gorodinsky. I've worked for the Jewish Federation of the Lehigh Valley, and I'm excited. We're excited to partner with Hartley Lachter and with the Institute in order for us to bring this moment in Jewish history. I'm going to pass the baton to Hartley, who will introduce our speaker, and we'll get going.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of the Berman Center for Jewish Studies at Lehigh University, it's my pleasure to see so many familiar faces back again for another episode in our Moments in Jewish History. Tonight, it's my pleasure to be able to introduce my friend and colleague from Lehigh University, Professor Rosalyn Weiss, who will be speaking with us this evening. And during her illustrious career at Lehigh, Professor Weiss has published 5 books and more than 50 articles in the areas of ancient Greek philosophy as well as medieval Jewish philosophy. She's taught a wide range of courses in philosophy and Jewish studies and Jewish philosophy for us at Lehigh, and has been an important part of our Jewish Studies program and the work of the Berman Center. Her most recent book, Hasdai Kreskis's Light of the Lord, or Hashem, was a translation and introduction and study that she did for Oxford University Press that was published in 2018. And a few years ago, I had the pleasure of being at a conference that was dedicated entirely to the study of this book upon its publication, with some luminaries in the field of the study of Jewish philosophy. And it was really a pleasure. And it's been an honor to be able to learn from Rosalyn at Lehigh. And it will be an honor for us all to be able to learn with her this evening as we once again spend some time in the Middle Ages in our Moments in Jewish History. So Rosalyn, please.
Thank you so much, Hartley. What a lovely introduction. And thank you, Aaron, for all of your help. And thank you all for being here. My pleasure to be here tonight to speak with you about 2 of my favorite philosophers, Moses Maimonides, with whom I'm sure you're all familiar, but also Hasdai Crescas, who was really of the same caliber, I would say, but unfortunately not as well known. He's probably actually a very obscure figure for most of us. I wanted to do 5 things tonight. I wanted to start just with a very brief biography of each of these 2 philosophers, and then I wanted to introduce you to their major works, and then talk about 2 concerns that they shared and that led to their major disagreements. And fourth, I wanted to turn to the passage from the Talmud that was on the handout that was circulated. I don't know if you've seen it, but if not, it will be on the screen at the time. And we look at how these 2 different philosophers with 2 different views looked to the same rabbinic passage to ground and support their particular view. And finally, we will turn to some of the ramifications, in particular the ramifications for prayer, for tefillah, that follows from their 2 distinct views. So in other words, they had distinct views of prayer that followed from their distinct views of the subjects that we'll be talking about tonight. Okay, so let me begin with the 2 biographies. They will be necessarily very short, so we can move on. So I'll start with Maimonides. Maimonides, I had always thought was born in 1135, but lately it's been revised and he was born in 1138. He was born in Muslim-ruled Cordoba, and for the first 10 years all was okay, but in 1148 there was a new sheriff in town. It was now the Almohads, also a Muslim sect, but they abolished the status of the Jews as that dhimmi status that gave them some protection, and the Jewish community there was forced to choose between exile, death, and conversion. And many Jewish families, and among them Moses Maimonides' family, chose exile. And so Maimonides and his family did quite a bit of traveling around, first in Spain, then they spent some time in Fez in Morocco. There was a short stint in the land of Israel, and Maimonides reports that visit that he had where he prayed on the Temple Mount, and he said it was a moment of holiness for him and for his descendants. He eventually ended up outside of Cairo in a city called Fustat, and while he was there, he suffered a terrible tragedy, which was the death of his beloved brother, David, who was a merchant and died at sea. He actually took a trip that Maimonides advised him against, but he did it anyway. He took a trip to India, and the ship drowned. And besides the terrible personal tragedy that this was for Maimonides, he also lost his brother's financial support, which meant that he had to quickly find some way to support not only his own family, but now also his brother's family, his wife and their daughter. And so Maimonides took up medicine, and he became a doctor, in fact, a very prominent doctor, and he worked in Fustat and in Cairo for first for the vizier Al-Qadi al-Fadl, and then finally for the Sultan Saladin. So he was really quite a prominent physician, and he was very, very busy and very, very exhausted. And how he was able to write the magnificent works he did is quite a mystery to me. He died in 1204. It's likely that he was buried first in the courtyard of the synagogue in Fustat, but he was, we think, he was then exhumed, his remains were exhumed, and he was reinterred in Tiberias in the land of Israel. Okay, that's the quick biography of Maimonides. We'll turn now quickly again to Chasdai Crescas. His dates are 1340 to 1410. He was born to a family of Jewish scholars and merchants, so he was fairly well-to-do as a young man. He studied in yeshivas. He was a very wonderful student. He learned a whole lot of things besides Jewish studies, many secular studies, as well as philosophy and Kabbalah. And he became quite a prominent rabbi in his own right. Eventually, he left Barcelona, where he was born, and he moved to Saragossa, which was like the capital of the Aragon crown. And there, the new king and queen appointed him the head of the entire Jewish community and vested legal authority for the entire Jewish community of Spain in him. So he was quite a prominent person. In 1391, there were horrific pogroms in the area, starting in Castilla but spilling over into Aragon. And like Maimonides, Crescas suffered a terrible tragedy, in his case, the loss of his only son to one of these pogroms. He didn't lose his faith as a result of that, but perhaps even his faith may even have been strengthened by this tragedy. His love for God somehow grew as a result of this tragedy. But it wasn't only his son that was lost. Many, many Jews perished, and even more Jews converted to Christianity. So that almost half the Jews of Spain converted, and by the time the pogroms had ended, about half of the population, the Jewish population of Spain, had converted to Christianity. So that was quite a loss, and it kind of fell to Crescas to preserve whatever could be preserved of these decimated Jewish communities. Okay, so that's it for the biography, and I now want to just talk for a moment about their greatest hits. Okay, so Maimonides, certainly in his own estimation, thought his greatest work was the Mishneh Torah, the 14-volume code of Jewish law that he composed. For many others of us, his masterpiece was the philosophic work, The Guide of the Perplexed. So he really did accomplish a lot with those two works and wrote many, many other works as well. Kreskas had hoped to write a 2-volume work, one volume of which would be an alternative to Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, to his Code of Jewish Law, and the other volume of this 2-volume work would be an alternative to the Guide of the Perplexed. Life got in the way, and so he only succeeded in producing one volume, the volume that we'll talk about tonight, which is Light of the Lord, or Hashem. And this volume was really meant to be the alternative to the Guide of the Perplexed, and Kreskas never got to write his alternative to the code. He had quite serious objections to Maimonides' Mishneh Torah and wanted to set things straight, but never got around to it, unfortunately. Okay, and now I wanted to talk a little bit about what spurred the two great books, Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed and Chasdai Kreskas's Light of the Lord. Maimonides' greatest fear, and it's the fear that he identifies as what caused him to write the Guide of the Perplexed, was that intelligent and educated Jews would abandon Judaism because of a great attraction to science and philosophy. So this was his fear, and this, as he says, is what drove him to write the Guide of the Perplexed. Kreskas's great fear, the one that I think drove him to write Light of the Lord, was that he too was afraid that educated and intelligent Jews would abandon Judaism, but he was afraid that they would abandon Judaism because of their great attraction to Maimonides. He saw Maimonides as a great danger, actually, to traditional Judaism. As much as he had reverence for Maimonides, he also had great trepidation. Interestingly, he tried to say that it was misinterpretations of Maimonides that would lead to people to abandon Judaism in this way. But I'm not sure that was in fact true. I'm not sure that it wasn't correct interpretations of Maimonides that might have had this effect of alienating Jews from Judaism. I just give you two brief quotes from Light of the Lord that will help you to see that Kreskas really regarded Maimonides as quite a danger. The first one is, I'll quote it. He says, "For although the words of the rabbi, our teacher," referring to Maimonides, "including even his remarks on secular matters, are dear to us and loved by us, the truth is yet more beloved." This is interesting in its own right, but also it's almost precisely the words that Socrates says in the Republic, in Republic 10, about Homer. Okay, that he had that same relationship with Homer, that he loved him, but the truth was more beloved. And interestingly, Aristotle, in his Metaphysics, says the same thing about Plato's followers, those who introduced the forms, says precisely the same thing, that we love them, but the truth is more beloved. The second quote is a quote from the Talmud, and here what Kreskas says is, "Wherever there is desecration of the holy name, desecration of God's name, one ought not to accord deference to the rabbi." This is something he says twice. He says it both in the introduction to Light of the Lord, and he says it as well in the chapter that we're going to talk about that contains his interpretation of the Talmudic passage. Okay, now we're moving on to the two concerns that they shared, that Maimonides and Kreskas shared, and that spurred them to very different views. One thing that's interesting about both of them, and this was, I think, a concern of both of them, is to present themselves not as innovators, but as firmly rooted in Jewish tradition. I think it was very important for both of them, and continues to be important to this day, for people who are, in fact, innovators in interpretation, in exegesis, in whatever it is, to somehow find a way of making it sound like this is nothing new, but this has always been here, and it was simply for us to discover it. So I think this is really one of the reasons that Maimonides turns to a rabbinic passage, as we'll see in our next section, turns to a rabbinic passage to bolster his philosophical views. And I think both of them, both Maimonides and Kreskas, feel more secure about their views. Sometimes the views are quite radical, but they feel more secure if they can find some kind of support in a rabbinic text. Often it takes quite a lot of ingenuity to turn those rabbinic texts into what they want them to say, but they are very ingenious, both of them, in interpreting texts so that it appears, at least, that what they are saying, these very new and perhaps radical ideas, are really old hat and really part and parcel of the rabbinic tradition. One of the ways in which Maimonides made that case was to say that the rabbis, like him, like Maimonides himself, often had to conceal their true views, but if you know how to read what they're saying, if you know how to read between the lines, you will see that in their views, in what they say, they hold the same views as Maimonides does. It's a bit far-fetched sometimes, but this is what he tries to maintain. The second concern for both of them, besides not wanting to appear like innovators, the second big concern for both of them was, of course, God and the nature of God. For Maimonides, there could be nothing worse than a person who holds a seriously mistaken view of God, has a seriously mistaken conception of God. In his time, in particular, there were many people, even quite learned people, rabbis, who believed that God has a body because, of course, the Torah portrays God as having a body. So this was one of the things that really drove him crazy and really spurred him to write his book. And even the Mishnah Torah really rails against this view of God as corporeal. But let me just say that any really erroneous understanding of God was something he was a fearless fighter against. So let me read you one passage from the Guide of the Perplexed. It's from chapter 60 of part 1, where you'll see exactly what I mean by this. Okay, so this is Maimonides in chapter 60. He says, "Let's say someone has heard of the elephant and knows that it is an animal and wishes to know its form and nature. A person who is either misled or misleading tells him it is an animal with 1 leg, 3 wings, lives in the depths of the sea, has a transparent body. Its face is wide like a human's face. It has the same form and shape as a human, speaks like a human, flies sometimes in the air, and sometimes swims like a fish. I should not say," Maimonides says, "that he described the elephant incorrectly, or that he has insufficient knowledge of the elephant, but I would say that the thing thus described is an invention and fiction, and that in reality there exists nothing like it. It is a non-existing being, called by the name of a really existing being. The present case, that is the case of wrong ideas about God, is analogous." So what he's saying, in effect, is that those of us who have wrong ideas of God don't have any idea of God at all. Okay? Okay, just like people have this wrong a view of an elephant, don't have any view of an elephant at all. For Maimonides, if we have a conception of God that is so wide of the mark, we are worshiping a non-existent being and not God, when there is a being who is God. And, not to beat around the bush, this is idolatry. Idolatry is to worship as God something that isn't God. If we are to worship God and avoid idolatry, we must first know what is and isn't true of God. The first question for Maimonides is then, what is God's nature and what can we know of God? And this will be Kreskas' central question as well. For our purposes tonight, where we're comparing these two thinkers, we're going to concentrate on the idea of divine attributes. Okay, there's nothing very esoteric about that. It's the claims we make about God, for example, that he's wise or that he's powerful. These are the things that we call divine attributes. In dealing with the question of whether God has divine attributes and what they are, both Maimonides and Kreskas are they're grappling with two very important issues. One issue is the idea of the oneness of God. We say in the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one." What does that mean? For the medieval thinkers, what it meant to say that the Lord is one was not simply, though it also was not simply to say that there's only one God. It was also to say that God himself is one. The word they used for it is simple, not composite, that God doesn't have any parts. The reason for that, of course, is that if God has parts, then he is not fundamental, but his parts are. That is, the parts have to be there before the whole, and if God has parts, then those parts would be more fundamental, we could say, than he himself is. So this was one thing that both Maimonides and Kreskas accepted, God's oneness in the sense of God's simplicity, his utter simplicity and non-compositeness. Okay, so that was one thing that drove their question about how to understand divine attributes. And for Maimonides, the issue was that if God has divine attributes, that is, if his essence has in it wisdom, power, etc., then his essence is not simple, but in fact composite. Okay, and so this was what troubled him, and Kreskas had to find a way of maintaining God's utter simplicity, even with having these attributes. And the way in which he tried to do that was to think metaphorically about the relationship between God's essence and what Kreskas called his essential attributes, to think about it metaphorically the way the sun and its rays are related to one another. We would not say that the rays of a sun are parts of the sun. Nevertheless, they're essential to the sun. One can't imagine the sun without rays or rays without the sun. And also, of course, the rays are dependent on the sun and not the other way around. So this was the way that Kreskas tried to deal with the question of divine attributes. He tried to say God has to have them, otherwise we can't say anything about God. What can we say? If we can't say he's wise and we can't say he's powerful, what is there to say about God? What is there to know about God? And indeed, Maimonides was willing to bite that bullet and say, indeed, that God has no attributes at all, that God does not have wisdom and power, etc., that God is completely simple and therefore has no attributes at all. The second issue that they were grappling with was then how to make sense of some of the biblical verses that suggest that there's nothing comparable to God. And they cite several verses, mostly from Isaiah and Jeremiah, that suggest that there's nothing comparable to God. Well, Maimonides takes that to mean, quite literally, that there's nothing like God. Okay? So for him, that meant that anything we say and know and are familiar with and can comprehend could not possibly be true of God. God is not like us, so he's so not like us that in fact there's nothing that we can say or understand with our intellects that could capture what's true of God. Kreskas wanted to say, well, not exactly, okay? We can still maintain God's utter incomparability to anything else just by maintaining the difference between finite and infinite. That is, whatever we do have in common with God, God still remains utterly incomparable in the sense that whatever we have finitely, and whatever God has, he has infinitely. And in fact, whatever we have finitely, we get from God bestowing those things on us. So he tried to maintain God's incomparability at the same time that he was refusing to give up on divine attributes altogether. You've probably heard of negative theology in association with Maimonides. I want to just spend a moment on that. If Maimonides says that God has no attributes, part of what he's saying, and this is what many people are familiar with, is that there's nothing positive, nothing affirmative we can say about God. But Maimonides permits, as he himself says, he permits negative attributes. What are negative attributes? Negative attributes are, most people think anyway, that what he means by negative attributes is the negation of the negation. Okay, so in other words, we can't say that God is wise, but we can say, it's permissible to say, that God is not unwise. We can't say that God is powerful, but we can say that God is not impotent, let's say. Okay, now I think this is not the correct understanding of what Maimonides means by the permissibility of negative attributes. He means that also, but he means, I think, primarily a much more radical thing, and that is that what's true of God is not only that he's not unwise, but it's true of God that he's not wise. It's not only true of God that he's not powerful, it's also true of God that he's not powerful. Meaning that whatever we mean by wise and powerful, those things do not apply to God. God cannot be comprehended by our conceptual apparatus, which is finite and quite limited, quite puny. And so what's true of God is only negative things, only that he isn't any of the things that we can conceive of at all. Which means, again, that he is incomparable in that sense as well, that there is nothing true that we can say about him. And oddly, what Maimonides says is those people are closest to God, understand God best, have the most correct conception of God, who can negate the most things. That is, those of us who can strip away from our understanding of God anything and everything we can think of, and we can prove that those things don't apply to God, we are the ones who are closest to God. Kreskas finds this outrageous, and what he says instead is the way we get closer to God is by loving him, by keeping the commandments, all the while recognizing the vast gap between God and us. But it's a gap that he thinks can be bridged by God's love in one direction and our love back in the other direction. So we have two very, very different thinkers in this respect of what God is and how one approaches God. Okay, so we are ready now to move along to the passage that I wanted to talk about with you tonight. Okay, so Erin, if you would share your screen and put the passage up. And if you could make it as legible as possible. Okay, we'll do our best with this. Maybe many of you have printed it out or have at least had a chance to read it. Okay, so we'll skip the Aramaic part and we'll go straight to the English. This is a Talmudic passage. It's from Brachot 33b, as it says here on your handout or your screen, and I'll read it to you. Okay, so this is what it says. A particular individual descended before the ark, so this was somebody who was going to lead the congregation in prayer, in the presence of Rabbi Hanina. Okay, so among the congregants was Rabbi Hanina. Rabbi Hanina chanted, God the great, the person in the presence of Rabbi Hanina chanted, God the great, the mighty, the awesome, the powerful, the fierce, the awe-inspiring, the strong, the fearless, the steadfast, and the honored. It was no easy task to find all of these English words for me, to have 10 different words for basically the same idea. Okay, anyway, I did find 10 different words. Okay, Rabbi Hanina waited for him until he completed the prayer. When he finished, Rabbi Hanina said to him, have you finished all the praises of your master? Why do I need all of these? Even concerning the 3 praises that we recite, so in the standard recitation of the prayer, the main prayer that is central to every prayer service, which is the Amidah, central to that prayer are 3 praises of God, the great, the mighty, and the awesome, Hagadol, Hagibor, v'Hanorah in Hebrew. Okay, so he's saying that even these 3 that we do recite regularly, had Moses, our teacher, not said them in the Torah, and had the men of the great assembly not come and incorporated them into the Amidah prayer, we would not be permitted to recite them. And you went on and recited all these. Okay, so the prayer leader added 7 more praises of God. This is comparable, Rabbi Hanina continues, this is comparable to a king who possessed many thousands of golden dinars, yet people were praising him for silver ones. Isn't that deprecatory to him? Okay, just to make clear how important this passage was to both of our thinkers, Maimonides, when he begins to present this passage in Book 1, Chapter 59 of the Guide, he exclaims, would that all Talmudic passages were like this one. Okay, this one holds a special place in his heart. And Kreskas, interestingly, quotes the whole passage. He quotes in full what Maimonides says about it, and he himself talks about it twice. He talks about it in Book 1, where he's talking about divine attributes, and he also talks about it in much later in Book 3b. So Book 3 has two parts, A and B. Book 3b. 3b is a section of Light of the Lord that deals with beliefs, mandatory beliefs, things we must believe, that are tied to particular commandments. And this passage comes in his discussion of prayer. Okay, so there's something that we learn about prayer from this passage. Okay, so let's first consider what Maimonides' interpretation of this wonderful, in his estimation, passage where Rabbi Hanina, he thinks, said something really awesome himself. Okay, so for him, what's happening here is that Rabbi Hanina rebukes the prayer leader because God has no attributes at all. Okay, so here's a case where we can see that Maimonides is finding his radical view that God has no attributes. He's finding it, he's tracing it back to Rabbi Hanina in this Talmudic passage. Okay, and it sounds like, well, it makes some kind of sense. okay? Because Rabbi Hanina says basically it's bad enough that we say the three that we say. Okay? And we wouldn't be permitted to say them were it not for these two special dispensations. So Maimonides concludes that Rabbi Hanina was well aware that God has no attributes and we shouldn't be praising him at all. That ideally we wouldn't be praising him at all. The only reason we're permitted to praise him is because Moses said these three words, the three words that he said, the first three of the 10, and when the men of the Great Assembly, when they were formalizing the prayer, they put these three praise words into the Amidah prayer, and it's because they sanctioned them that we're permitted to say them. But otherwise, we shouldn't be saying any of these praises. Why should we not be saying these praises? Well, it's obvious, because anything we say about God demeans him. Whatever I think, great, awesome, fearless, any of these words means, they don't apply to God. God is way more different, incomparable, and can't be captured in any way by any words that I use. So when I use my words for him, when I apply what I understand by strong to God, I'm selling him short. Okay, so this is how Maimonides understands this passage, and he thinks that this passage strongly supports his belief that God has no attributes. Okay, and that's why it's wrong to say even the three that we do say, and certainly it's wrong to multiply these praises. In fact, in this chapter, Maimonides goes on to rebuke and chastise all the amazing liturgical poets that we've had, that the Jewish people have had, that have enhanced our prayers. If you think about the prayers on the high holidays, they go on and on and on. And Maimonides thought that with each of these liturgical excesses, we are actually diminishing God and insulting him rather than exalting him, as of course was the intention of these poets. Okay, so that's Maimonides on this passage. If we turn now to Crescas on this passage, we find a very different take on it. Okay, and it's quite revealing of the two of them and the difference between them. Okay, so we already know that Crescas believes that God does have essential attributes. Though, of course, they're incomparable to our attributes in the way that anything that's infinite is incomparable to something that's finite. He treats the passage twice, as I mentioned to you. They're not that different, but there are subtle differences. I think it's probably true for both Maimonides and Crescas that if they treat the same topic twice, they're saying something new the second time. So we're going to focus on just one extra thing, one extra feature of Crescas' second treatment of this passage. In the first passage, what he says, this is in Book 1, Part 3 of Light of the Lord, Crescas says that Rabbi Hanina wasn't worried about the possibility that divine attributes or divine praises are impermissible. That wasn't what he was worried about. What Rabbi Hanina was worried about is the impression made by the prayer leader when he added 7 more to the first 3, the impression that he left with the congregation that now all of the praises of God have been enumerated. In other words, he left the impression that 3 weren't enough, but now that we've done 10, now we've really nailed it. Okay, now we have really named, listed, enumerated all of the praises of God. And so in effect, what Crescas is saying is that what worried Rabbi Hanina was not that we're praising God, but that we think we've finished praising God. And Kreskas adds that this was especially problematic because the way the rabbis set up the commandment to pray to God, was that the essence of prayer to God, this might surprise you, but the essence of prayer to God is supplication. It's really asking God for things, turning to God and asking Him for things. But the rabbis did not permit supplication, even though that is the essence of prayer, without first praising God. And so, when the prayer leader introduced so many praises of God, it was to fulfill the obligation to praise before you supplicate, and that would even more leave the impression that now he thinks he's finished with the praises and he can go on to the supplication. So this was the danger that Kreskas thought Rabbi Hanina was picking up on and was chastising the prayer leader for. He said to him, "Have you finished? Right? Is this all the ones there are? This is not okay to add some arbitrary number as if you have now fulfilled your obligation to praise before you supplicate, and everyone will think that this is it. This is the limit of the praises of God." The very fact, he says, that Maimonides, the very fact that Moses said these praises in the Torah, that's enough to mean that they're permissible. I mean, if Moses said them, they're certainly permissible. And even all the other ones that the other guy said, that the prayer leader said, they're also in the Torah. So clearly they're permissible. So that's not even an issue. So for him, the reason we're allowed to say them is because we're allowed to say them. There's nothing dangerous or harmful about praising God. The problem was only too few praises, rather than what Maimonides thought, any praises at all. Okay, so since we need to praise before we supplicate, the men of the Great Assembly came in and they gave us this very minimal 3 praises for God, which would not suggest to anyone that we have finished all the praises that God merits. Okay, so that's what he talks about in his first at-bat in interpreting this passage. The second time that he deals with this passage, which is in part 3, where he talks about prayer, here he makes one further point. It's kind of the same point, but it's just slightly different. And here what he says is, it's not the problem. The problem is not that there are too few, the problem is not with praising per se. And it's not simply that 10 is too few. The problem is that God's praise, or God's attributes, however you want to look at it, God's attributes are infinite. It's not that we have too few or too many. It's that God's attributes have no number at all. So this kind of salvages the incomparability of God to anything else, that he's not on any scale. One can't measure. One can't say, oh, but he's got more than that. No, he hasn't got more than that. He's got an infinite number, which is not a number at all. There is no number to correspond to the number of attributes that God has. And so, following along the same lines, Kreskas here says very much the same thing. He says it's perfectly fine to praise God. Of course, we have to praise God. Moses did it. The Bible has many praises of God in it. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that nothing we say about God can really do him justice. And so we have to be very careful about what we say. And we stick to the minimum of 3, which, as Kreskas points out, is the smallest number once you get to the plural. Okay, so not the 1, not the 2, but the plural. The smallest number of that is 3, and the rabbi stuck to that smallest number as so as not to convey any sort of idea that we're capturing all of the praises of God. Okay, and now I'm up to the last session. The last section I see is getting quite late. So in this last section, I just want to address the issue of the ramifications for prayer or for our relationship with God that follows from these two different views of this passage of Brachot 33b. Kreskas thinks, when he talks in that second interpretation, the second time that he deals with this passage, what he's saying is that the commandment to pray, the mitzvah to pray, that it teaches us certain beliefs. Okay, so he's talking in this section about beliefs that are connected to commandments. And here he's talking about prayer and what beliefs are connected with the commandment to pray. And his answer is, we learn from prayer to believe that God is responsive, that he hears our prayers, that he hears us, and that he responds to us. That's what we learn. That's the truth that we learn from the mitzvah of prayer. Does Maimonides think that God hears our prayers, that he responds to us? The answer is absolutely not. He does not think so. God is too transcendent to answer our prayers, to hear our prayers. And the two favorite verses, biblical verses for Maimonides, the ones he embraces most strongly, are first, this one is Psalms 65, verse 2. This is in Hebrew, L'cha dumiyah tehillah, which he translates, there are other ways of translating it, but he translates it, to you, silence is praise. Nothing we can say could possibly praise God. So the best praise that we could give God is to shut up, to simply not say anything. The other verse that he quotes in this context is Imru bilvavchem al nafshechem al mishkavchem v'domu selah, okay, which translates to commune with your heart upon your bed and be silent. Okay, so the best thing you can do if you want to praise God is when you're alone at night after you've taken care of all your business and you're on your bed by yourself, be quiet. Don't say anything. Anything you say is degrading to God. If we look, by contrast, at the two verses that Kreskas favors, we'll see a completely different point of view. Kreskas says, he quotes Psalm 145, verse 17. You may know this verse from the Ashrei prayer. He says, Karov Hashem l'chol korav l'chol asher yikra'uhu be'emet, which translates to, the Lord is near to all who call upon him, to all who call upon him in truth. And what he derives from this is that if you pray sincerely, not just with your mouth, but in truth, that God will hear you and God will respond to you. And in fact, he will respond to all those who call upon him, even those who are unworthy. Even those who are unworthy, if they pray to him, he will respond. And not only that, he will favor them for having prayed, because prayer itself is a mitzvah. And the second verse that he quotes a lot, okay, is also in the Ashrei prayer. And this is the end of the Ashrei prayer, where it's verse 21 of the same chapter, Psalms 145. Tilat Hashem yidaber pi vivarech kol basar shem kodsho li'olam va'ed. Okay, which means my mouth will speak the praise of the Lord, and all flesh will bless his name forever, his holy name forever and ever. Okay, and here Kreskas says, my mouth will speak. That's the psalmist speaking, the perfect psalmist, that God will listen to the praise of one who is perfect, but it continues, all flesh will bless his holy name forever and ever. So God is responsive to anyone who approaches him, both the perfect and the imperfect. And that's Kresgas's view. Okay, so let me just say one sentence in conclusion. I have hoped to have shown you that how two great medieval Jewish philosophers turned to an ancient rabbinic text to support their different views of God and the proper way for us to approach him. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you so much, Rosalind. That was great. And I forgot to mention at the outset that you can put your questions in the chat. So we've got quite, but please feel free to drop any questions you have into the chat, and then we will, I will be able to take them. In fact, we have one right now. So let me just read this from our very own colleague, Ben Wright at Lehigh University. He has two questions. Did either Hasdai Crescas or Maimonides read Christian disputes about how to describe God? We have, of course, such sources such as Pseudo-Dionysius and others who resort to the Via Negativa. And then his other question is whether or not in Maimonides' thought is God so simple that gendered language with respects to God becomes a problem, i.e. that God has any gender, despite the fact that the Bible consistently applies masculine language to God.
Okay, I'm going to pass on the first question. It's just, I think I'm pretty sure the answer is yes, but I don't know enough about it to actually give you a really informed answer. So I'm going to pass on that one, and I'm going to try to make up for it by dealing with your second question. Maimonides takes everything in the Torah with a huge grain of salt. In other words, all the language that's used for God in the Torah is metaphorical for him. He does not take any of it literally, and he thinks it's quite sinful, in fact, to take it literally, to take any view of God that implies that he has a body, a gender, limbs, that he hears or speaks, or any of those words. All of those things are not true of God, and he has a very tough time dealing with the misleadingness of the Torah. That is, for most of us who read it, we read it, and the Torah actually misleads us, makes us think that God has a body, that God has a gender, that God has limbs, that God hears and sees and speaks, right? All of those things that are actually not true. So he says, by way of justifying the Torah doing this dastardly thing of taking us in the completely wrong direction, and he saw in his own times that even the great rabbis of his generation believed that God has a body because the Torah says so. So what he did in order to justify what the Torah did is he says that the Torah speaks to ordinary people, and ordinary people have trouble believing in the existence of a being that doesn't have a body, and perhaps we might say a being that doesn't have a gender. It might be hard to even imagine that such a thing exists. But once people understand that God exists, then the job of every thinking person is to then strip away anything that smacks of the corporeal, certainly including anything gendered. Definitely.
Another question is about, and this is a question I have, is about the anxieties that drove both Maimonides and Kresgas, which was about the possibility of losing Jews to either just irreligiosity or conversion, because in Maimonides' case, he felt that they would be tempted away by the greater rationality of Islam in particular, which he saw as having done a better job of incorporating rational thought and that the lack of that Jews exposed to Aristotelian philosophy would have a hard time reconciling that with biblical and rabbinic Judaism, and that this would cause a problematic conflict for them. Whereas for Kreskas, he felt that the conflict would be the one between traditional Judaism and Maimonides, and that was where they were going to have trouble. But of course, in Maimonides' day, there were Jews who were not observant, but mass conversion was not very common. In Kreskas' day, mass conversion certainly was a phenomenon in the wake of and during the course of the violence of 1391 in Spain, where almost 100,000 Jews are killed, and many Jews do convert. But of course, they do so forcibly. Do we think that Kreskas really thought that exposure to philosophy was the culprit behind the significant rate of conversion to Christianity among his fellow Spanish Jews at that time, and that his book could be a remedy?
Okay, so let me start by saying that Maimonides also faced mass conversions. You know, in Maimonides' own time, he even had to write about this problem of conversion. You know, how serious is it to convert to Islam? You know, is it?
Yeah.
You know, and the choices facing the people in Spain was precisely the choice between conversion, exile, and death. And many people did indeed choose conversion. Maybe you know this, but there is quite a respectable tradition of scholarship that says that Maimonides' family itself converted for a while, you know, to avoid death. Wasn't a sincere conversion, and in fact, all the Jews who converted were suspected of not converting sincerely in Maimonides' day. I think it's not the halting of conversion to Christianity that worried Kreskas, or Maimonides for that matter. It really was the worry of the educated Jew, the enlightened Jew, and what would attract such a thinking person. I think Maimonides, at least when he introduces the guide, what he says is, my purpose in the guide is to help you to read the Torah so that it doesn't conflict with philosophy. So in other words, to go beneath the surface, see that everything on the surface is metaphorical and the truth lies beneath. And once you learn to interpret the Torah correctly, you will find no conflict between, let's say, Aristotle and the Torah. Kreskas was horrified by that. The idea that what we need to do is make sure that there's no conflict between Aristotle and the Torah. Okay? He wanted to really say that the Torah has much to offer, that in fact Aristotelianism is incorrect, certainly can't prove itself, okay? and hope to, I think, attract the intelligent people who might have been drawn to Maimonides away from that. So I think not so much, I don't think either of them was so much addressing the ordinary Jew who might convert for safety reasons or such, but really the intelligentsia. I think that was really what he was concerned about, what both of them were concerned about. Kreskas' work is so difficult that one can't even imagine the ordinary person delving into it. So, and similarly for the guide, very difficult work. And I think certainly for Maimonides, deliberately so. It wasn't meant for everyone.
Yeah, and there he even encourages, right, in the introduction, for those who are not well versed in Aristotelian philosophy, he basically says you don't have this problem, so just put this book away. It's not for you. It's only for people who already find themselves stuck in the conflict between.
Right. I think I would just add to that I think one thing he did hope to accomplish for all people, even ordinary people, was to really divest them of this idea that God has a body, because that's like the elephant.
Yeah.
The elephant that's not an elephant.
The wrong elephant.
Yeah.
There's one other question here, which is, which view today is more prevalent? If I guess that, meaning which philosophy, the one that's more like Kreskas or the one that's more like Maimonides, would you say has been more widely embraced?
Yes, it's a wonderful question. It's really the question of why nobody ever heard of Chasdai Kreskas. One could say, one could rephrase the question that way. I hadn't. I had only barely heard of him at the time that I decided to translate his work. Actually, what happened was I thought I would teach Kreskas in my Jewish philosophy class, and then discovered to my chagrin that no one had ever translated it into English, at which time I decided to tackle it. So he really, to even pose the question is to assume that people have heard of Chasdai Kreskas and could actually choose between Maimonides and Kreskas, which I think is really not a viable option. Maybe with the publication of the book that will change a little bit. I hope so, but it's not really an issue. I think the vagaries of history were such that the very sophisticated alternative to Maimonides that Kreskas offered was simply not viable. People either abandoned this kind of intellectual Judaism that Maimonides offered and just became traditional, or they did Maimonides. Nobody saw Kreskas as a viable alternative to these. And I think Kreskas was well aware of the power of Maimonides, and he was right that anyone who did want a really sophisticated intellectual kind of Judaism would gravitate to Maimonides. So yeah, I think that's the answer to your question. That today, I think today the truth of the matter is that people who are drawn to Maimonides really spend their time interpreting him much more than being a follower. I don't know how many followers there are of the Maimonides of the Guide. He has his followers of the legal, the halachic work, the Mishnah Torah, but he probably has more scholars interested in his guide than he has actual adherents to his view.
I mean, it would be an interesting question if we look at, certainly no one studies Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed as part of a traditional rabbinic curriculum, right? Whereas his Mishnah Torah, his legal, his halachic work is absolutely foundational and considered very important. And it's sort of remarkable that his philosophy can be kind of politely ignored. I wonder how many people are reading the Guide of the Perplexed in traditional settings and regarding this as how they would approach questions about what sorts of discourse about God is possible and what sorts of ideas about God are possible. It doesn't seem to resonate with much in sort of traditional Jewish thought in the 20th and 21st centuries.
I think the place where he's most popular is Chabad. They seem to have gravitated to the guide. I don't know how they interpret it so that it comes out sort of kosher, but they are quite enamored of the guide, not just the Mishnah Torah. So it's interesting. Some of the ideas in the Mishnah Torah are so radical that I know scholars who think the Mishnah Torah is more radical than the guide. So that's another interesting little wrinkle.
Of course, in a rabbinic curriculum, they're only reading the legal parts of it.
Right, true.
All right, well, we're at and just over time, so I want to say thank you very much to our speaker this evening, Professor Rosalind Rice. Thank you to all of you. Thanks, of course, to the Federation and to Aaron for inviting us to be part of this series, and it has been a real pleasure. And Aaron, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what is coming up next as we continue to progress through history for our various moments.
Absolutely. We're looking forward to seeing everybody on March 24th, which is on a Wednesday, and we're going to be hearing from Dr. Nitan Levovich, and he's going to talk about between genocide and climate change. Is there a lesson to be learned from the Holocaust? So I'm sure it's going to be fascinating and lesson, and we're looking forward to seeing you all in about a month. And in the meantime, stay healthy. Hopefully everybody's vaccinated by then, and we can start planning or next year when we can all sit in person and be at Lehigh University, beautiful theater full of people, and we can all see each other. But in the meantime, we're looking forward to seeing you on Zoom on March 24th. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.